The greatest fitness supplement of all time increases strength and lean muscle growth, reduces recovery time, causes virtually no side effects, and is one of the most thoroughly researched dietary supplements in the world, and is also one of the cheapest supplements on the market. Its only downside is that it may cause water retention. Unfortunately, many people hear the word bloat and check out. The supplement in question is, of course, creatine. It's one of the first things I recommend to people when they ask for tips in the gym. But what is creatine? Creatine is naturally created in your liver and kidneys and is naturally found in meat, fish, and dairy. Creatine helps to replenish ATP, as the phosphorylated form provides an immediate source of high-energy phosphate groups that are picked up by ADP to reform ATP, thereby serving as a buffer that maintains ATP production. ATP is often described as the energy currency of the body, and that is because energy is required to bond the 3 phosphate groups to the adenosine group, and when your body is in need of quick energy, it breaks the bond using the enzyme kinase. All of the energy that was keeping the phosphate group bonded can then be used by your muscles. This is the mechanism through which creatine supports bursts of high-intensity exercise, which is why creatine is most recommended for activities like weightlifting or sprinting, in which ATP is the primary energy source. But is creatine only useful for resistance or power type activities? Well, there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that creatine supplementation may also provide beneficial effects for other activities. Creatine has been found to promote greater glycogen storage, which directly promotes recovery and preventing overtraining. Creatine may also help athletes recover from intense exercise and/or tolerate intensified periods of training to a greater degree, as evidenced by a 2009 study in which individuals supplementing with creatine experienced less muscle damage, inflammation, and muscle soreness in response to running 30 kilometers as well as 4 weeks of intensified training. Thirdly, there is evidence that athletes who supplement with creatine during training experience fewer musculoskeletal injuries, accelerated recovery time from injury, and less muscle atrophy after immobilization, though it is unclear whether this is due to a greater resistance to injury and/or the ability to recover from injury. Fourthly, there is such compelling evidence that creatine is neuroprotective that the International Society of Sports Medicine recommends that athletes engaged in sports that have a potential for concussion and/or spinal injury take creatine for its neuroprotective effects. And lastly, creatine may reduce the risk of heat-related illness when athletes train in hot and humid environments, which may be surprising to those under the impression that creatine causes dehydration. Because creatine is an osmotically active substance, it is speculated that it can cause dehydration, cramping, and electrolyte balance during exercise and/or in increased environmental temperature. There is a fair amount of anecdotal evidence in support of this from self-reported surveys, but they are in contradiction to experimental and clinical evidence, such as in one experimental study that monitored 72 NCAA football players throughout a football season and actually found the creatine users to have less cramping, heat illness and dehydration, muscle tightness, muscle strains, and total injuries than the placebo group. And in a clinical study of hemodialysis patients who frequently reported muscle cramping, the experimental group, who was provided creatine 5 minutes prior to hemodialysis, experienced a 60% decline in muscle cramping. So while there is an abundance of anecdotal evidence of creatine causing dehydration and cramping, experimental and clinical research does not support the idea. And these findings should come as no surprise when we think back to osmosis and realize that creatine is stored within muscle cells. Osmosis will actually cause water to be drawn into the muscle cells, hydrating them. Anabolic steroids are a synthetic version of testosterone and is used in conjunction with resistance training with the intent of enhancing muscle mass and strength due to increases in muscle protein synthesis. This increase in muscle protein synthesis is due to testosterone's ability to enter the muscle cell, bind with the intracellular androgen receptor, and increase the expression of various muscle-specific genes. Both creatine and anabolic steroids can increase strength and hypertrophy, but creatine does so indirectly by facilitating with ATP production, which increases muscle power, repetitions, and exercise volume, which can subsequently contribute to muscle performance and hypertrophy over the course of a training period. While the physiological and performance outcomes of anabolic steroids and creatine can be similar, their mechanisms of action and legal categorization are not. Anabolic steroids are drugs with a different chemical structure than creatine, and they are Class C, Schedule III controlled substances regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, and subject to the regulatory control provisions of the Controlled Substances Act set forth by the Drug Enforcement Association. Creatine, on the other hand, like many other dietary supplements, fits well within the confines of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, which is a statute of United States federal legislation which defines and regulates dietary supplements by the FDA for good manufacturing practices. It is illegal to possess and administer anabolic steroids without a physician's prescription, but there is no legal ramifications for the possession or ingestion of creatine. The theory that creatine supplementation increases fat mass is a concern amongst some exercising individuals, possibly because some experience a gain in body mass from creatine supplementation. However, randomized controlled trials do not validate this claim. In a 3-week study on swimmers, no effect on body composition was found. In another study on recreationally active females, the addition of creatine to high-intensity interval training had no effect on body composition. And in a 4-week study on male bodybuilders, creatine supplementation had no effect on fat mass. Now, you may be thinking that these studies are too short to come to any definitive conclusion, but there are plenty of long-term studies that also concludes that creatine does not increase fat mass, such as this 12-week trial on resistance training males whose fat mass was unaffected, but lean mass and muscle fiber size increased. This 32-week trial in older adults whose fat mass was unaffected and lean body mass increased, and this meta-analysis on randomized controlled trials involving creatine supplementation in conjunction with resistance training on fat mass in older adults. In 2019, it reviewed 19 studies with a total of 609 participants, where the creatine group actually lost about 1 pound more than the placebo group. In summary, creatine supplementation does not increase fat mass across a variety of populations. Sarcopenia is a progressive skeletal muscle condition defined by a decrease in muscle mass, strength, and functionality that is associated with an increased likelihood of falls, fractures, physical disability, and mortality. Sarcopenia can be induced by a variety of things, such as a lack of physical activity, malnutrition, and insulin resistance. But it can also be induced just by aging. After age 50, muscle mass declines by an average of 1 to 2% annually. It's estimated that 5 to 13% of those aged 60 to 70 are affected by sarcopenia, and increases to 11 to 50% for those aged 70 to 80. The primary treatment and preventative measure against sarcopenia is exercise therapy, including resistance training, especially when paired with creatine, which provides the same benefits to older adults as it does to younger adults. Creatine monohydrate powder has been the most extensively studied and commonly used form of creatine since the early 1990s. Short-term loading with creatine monohydrate has been reported to increase intramuscular creatine stores by 20 to 40% and exercise performance capacity by 5 to 10%. Creatine monohydrate supplementation during training has been reported to promote gains in muscle mass, strength, and exercise capacity. Despite the known efficacy, safety, and low cost of creatine monohydrate, a number of different forms of creatine have been marketed as more effective with fewer anecdotally reported adverse effects. These marketing efforts have fueled speculation that creatine monohydrate is not the most effective or safest form of creatine to consume. This notion is clearly refuted by understanding the well-known physiochemical properties of creatine monohydrate, as well as the current creatine supplementation literature. A number of different forms of creatine have been marketed as more effective sources of creatine than creatine monohydrate. However, there are no peer-reviewed published papers showing that the ingestion of equal amounts of creatine salts or other forms of creatine increases creatine storage in muscle to a greater degree than creatine monohydrate. In fact, most studies show that ingestion of these other forms have less physiological impact than creatine monohydrate on intramuscular creatine stores and/or performance, and that any performance differences were more related to other nutrients that the creatine is bound to or co-ingested within supplement formulations. This makes sense given that these other forms contain less creatine per gram than creatine monohydrate, and that 99% of ingested creatine monohydrate is absorbed into the blood and then taken up into the muscle or excreted in urine. Creatine monohydrate crystallizes from water as monoclinic prisms that hold 1 molecule of water per molecule of creatine. Subsequent drying of creatine monohydrate at about 100 degrees Celsius removes the water of crystallization, yielding anhydrous creatine, which is 100% creatine. Creatine monohydrate powder contains the highest percentage of creatine at 87.9%, other than creatine anhydrous, which is 100%. Creatine monohydrate powder is very stable, showing no signs of degradation into creatinine over years, even at elevated storage temperatures. However, creatine is not stable in solution due to intramolecular cyclization that converts creatine into creatinine, especially at higher temperatures and lower pH. The degradation of creatine can be reduced or halted by lowering the pH to under 2.5 or increasing the pH above 12.1. This is the reason that less than 1% of creatine monohydrate is degraded into creatinine during the digestive process. The lack of solubility and stability of creatine in solution is the reason that creatine is primarily marketed in powder form, and efforts to develop stable beverages containing a physiologically effective dose of creatine at 3 to 5 grams have been unsuccessful. If dissolved in water, much of the creatine would degrade into creatinine before a consumer had the chance to purchase it. In summary, creatine monohydrate is the optimal choice in terms of efficacy and price. Now that I have successfully convinced you to start supplementing with creatine monohydrate, let's talk how to supplement. Creatine is naturally found in meat, fish, and dairy, but usually not in amounts high enough to keep an optimal muscle saturation. Hence, creatine supplementation in powder form is recommended to keep optimal muscle saturation. Creatine is also found in capsule form if you are made of money, and an 80% increase in cost is worth the convenience. In 1992, Roger Harris and his colleagues published the seminal paper finding that loading with creatine increased skeletal muscle creatine stores, in which a load consisted of 7 days where you take 5 grams 4 times per day, followed by a maintenance phase where you just take 5 grams once per day. However, a common misconception about creatine supplementation is that individuals must load with creatine to receive its benefits. But the daily dosing strategy of just taking 3 to 5 grams per day for 4 weeks will accumulate the same muscle saturation as a 1-week load. So if you're in a hurry to start enjoying the benefits of creatine by the end of the week, do a loading phase. Otherwise, just starting to take 3 to 5 grams daily will give you the same benefits after 4 weeks.